Welcome to Unit 3 on the Constitution, Lecture 3, which is on the principles of the Constitution. All right, so there are 6 principles in the Constitution, and this is what the state of Oklahoma has stated as the 6 principles. You could Google this and find additional lists that include some of the same ones, maybe include some additional ones. I've seen lists of 7 or 8. I will mention at the end some additional principles that might be considered, but these are the 6 that, according to Oklahoma standards, that you are to know as principles of the Constitution. All right, so the first one on your notes guide, the first one should be listed as limited government. And we have talked about this term before. We talked about it with Unit 1 in terms of democracy versus dictatorships. A democracy has a limited government. The government is not all powerful. They can't do whatever they want because they're limited in what they are told to do. So government only has the powers the Constitution gives it. It's what makes us a democracy. Our Constitution limits this. If we were a dictatorship, the government could do whatever they wanted, and it wouldn't matter what was listed in the Constitution or not. But we are a democracy, and our Constitution limits our government. An example of this is that even the president must follow the laws of the land. So the president can't steal, the president can't hurt somebody, the president can't not pay their taxes. They have to follow the law just like everybody else. This includes congressional members. They all have to follow the law as well. If someone works for the federal government, the law still applies to them even though they work for the federal government. Our second principle is judicial review. This one sometimes shows up on lists and sometimes doesn't. Just be aware if you ever are looking at other lists. Some people do not include judicial review as a principle of the Constitution. So judicial review is just the power of a court in the United States, that would be the Supreme Court, to determine the constitutionality of a governmental action. So this is where the Supreme Court gets to determine whether or not an action taken by one of the other 2 branches, the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch, or the executive branch, the enforcement branch, is in line and agrees with the Constitution of the United States. An example of this would be the Supreme Court ruling that the Affordable Care Act, which is also known as Obamacare, is legal or constitutional, that the structure of this law and how it is set up and how it it applies to the country is constitutional, is within the acceptance of the Constitution's powers to the federal government. Another example would be the court case Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court ruled in that case that the doctrine of separate but equal was not constitutional. It did not line up with the Constitution. So, separate but equal facilities was not allowed in schools anymore. Our third principle is checks and balances. This is a term you probably have heard before. Most definitely way back in 8th grade, you should have heard this term before when you studied U.S. history and covered the founding. So checks and balances is just that each branch, in this case it is the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, has the power to check or limit or control the actions of the other 2. And it's just a way to ensure that one branch does not abuse its powers. So an example of this is the president can veto a law. That is a power the president has. That's a check on the legislative branch. But Congress can override a presidential veto. So the president vetoes a law, says, nope, this is not going to be a law. And then Congress can come back and say, nope, we really think that this should be a law and we're going to override this. And so that's a check on that power of the president. And then ultimately, the Supreme Court could potentially rule that law that was passed, that the president vetoed, Congress overrode and passed. They could determine that that law did not follow the Constitution, and therefore it can't be a law. So that would be a check on Congress, or if it was a normal passing bill through both houses, no veto involved, it would be a check on both houses or on both branches. Separation of powers is our third one. This one is oftentimes very intertwined with checks and balances. And this is another term that you should have learned and discussed way back in 8th grade, if not also in United States history junior year. But the Constitution divides government into 3 branches, each with its own duties. So this is the legislative branch is the lawmaking branch, and then the Constitution gives, lists out in the Constitution the powers that the legislative branch has. The executive branch is the enforcement branch. It's the job of the president and the executive agencies to ensure that the laws that have been passed by Congress are being enacted and enforced across the country. And then the judicial branch is the interpretation and application branch. So they're going to take the laws that have been passed by the Constitution, by the legislative branch, and apply them into cases that come before them, regardless. And this is like from the lowest federal court all the way up to the Supreme Court. So an example of this is the legislative branch passes laws, executive branch carries out laws, and judicial branch interprets laws. Federalism. We have talked about this concept in Unit 1 when we were talking about how power can be divided, in reference to like a unitary government where all the power is at the central government at the top, or a confederation government where the power is in the local governments. And then we talked about that there was a federal system in which they shared power, or there was a division of power, and that's what federalism is. So federalism, you need to be referencing that image that we had for the federal system in Unit 1, but it is just the division of power between the federal government and state government. So there are certain things that the federal government gets to do and certain things that the national or the state government. So an example here is because there is nothing in the Constitution about education. It is largely a state issue. So if it's not listed under federalism, if it's not listed in the Constitution, then it is a state issue. So marriage is not mentioned in the Constitution. Divorce is not mentioned in the Constitution. The requirements for voting are very limited in the Constitution. So it's really up to the states to determine all of those things, because the Constitution does not give it to the national government. So make sure you write like those examples down. Make sure you write down that if it's not spelled out to the national government in the Constitution, then it belongs to the states. Make sure you have that there. And then popular sovereignty. This is where the people are the primary source of government's authority. And we've talked about the term sovereignty before. Maybe pause a moment, go look back at your Unit 1 notes on what makes the 4 characteristics of a government. So when we talked about the 4 characteristics of a government, we said they had to have people, it had to have a government, it had to have a territory, and it had to have sovereignty. It could not have anyone above it. So when we talk about popular sovereignty, we're saying that our government, the Constitution, has a system in which the people, the citizens, are the primary source of government's authority. What does government get to do? We, the people, will inform the government what we want them to do. And the greatest example of that is the first 3 words of the Constitution, we, the people, in the preamble. Now this one is not on your paper, but this one gets included a lot as a principle of the Constitution. So you might want to write it off to the side somewhere just so you have it. But republicanism is people have the power in government through representatives. So government can't have too much power. So this is about where we're a republic, and how do we establish that we're a republic in the document, the Constitution. It's through the election. So we have we're going to have representatives. So we're going to have House of Representatives to represent the people and speak on their behalf. So example, people elect members to the House of Representatives every 2 years to ensure the people maintain power. But that means we, the people, have to do our job to ensure that we're electing the best people for the job. All right, that wraps up this third set of notes under Unit 3 Constitution. If you have any questions, let me know. And remember, don't do anything too stupid. Bye.